Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the latest in our Diplomat webinar series. On the agenda today is Indonesia's presidency of the G20, how it's gone so far in 2022, what to expect for the rest of the year, and what it might reflect about the broader trajectories of Indonesian foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. Indonesia's presidency of the G20 economic grouping, no doubt many years in the making, got off to an inauspicious start this year when Russian President Vladimir Putin sent his troops into Ukraine. This naked act of aggression and the ensuing cold conflict between Russia and the West has threatened to swamp Indonesia's agenda for the G20. First, the Indonesian government has chosen to adapt a studiedly neutral position on the war in Ukraine. Like most of its Southeast Asian neighbors, except for Singapore, it is eschewed participation in the international campaign of sanctions against Russia. Meanwhile, Russia's membership of the G20 has landed this fundamentally economic grouping at the heart of the strategic tensions between Russia and the West, and placed Indonesia's Ukraine policy under intense international scrutiny. The G20 has also been accompanied by an unusually busy diplomatic schedule for President Joko Widodo. The tensions of the Russia-Ukraine war have prompted him to undertake a peace mission to Ukraine and Russia, during which he offered Indonesia's good offices as a mediator of the conflict and attempted to secure exports of grain from Ukraine to alleviate global shortages. And this has been followed last week by visits to Japan, China, and South Korea, where he's attempted to drum up foreign investment, amongst other things. And so how Jokowi's administration has handled the G20 and the attendant challenges offers an interesting opportunity to ask what foreign policy legacy Indonesia's leader is likely to leave when he exits office in a couple of years' time. It's also a good opportunity to interrogate and examine the broader currents of Indonesian foreign policy in a new age of turbulence and superpower rivalry. Is the country's tradition of foreign policy non-alignment, bebas dan aktif, an independent and active foreign policy, is this fit for purpose in this new age of strategic competition? And so to ponder these and related questions, we're very privileged today to be joined by a distinguished all-Indonesian panel of commentators and experts. Our first speaker will be Dr. Rizal Sukma, a senior fellow and one-time executive director of the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta. Dr. Rizal was served as Indonesian ambassador to the UK, Ireland, and the International Maritime Organization from 2016 to 2020. And so he has personal view of the inside workings of Jokowi's foreign ministry, which I think might be very interesting for some of our audience. He's also the author of what I would describe as an indispensable book on the relationship between Beijing and Jakarta, Indonesia and China, the politics of a troubled relationship, which is an indispensable primer if anyone is interested. Also beaming in from Indonesia's capital is Dr. Shafiah Muhibat. Dr. Shafiah is also a denizen of CSIS in Jakarta and currently serves as the organization's Deputy Executive Director for Research. She's researched and published widely on a range of topics, including regional security in the Indo-Pacific, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, maritime security, and Indonesian foreign policy. Rounding out our panel is Professor Gede Wahyu Wicaksana, a senior lecturer of international relations in the Faculty of Social and Political Sciences at Universitas Airlangga in Surabaya. He has published articles in a range of distinguished journals, including Asian Security, the Asian Journal of Political Science, the Pacific Review, and many others. Before we get things started, I just wanted to offer a quick note about how we're going to format today's discussion. To begin with, I will be inviting each of the three speakers to talk for about 10 minutes about various aspects of today's topic. After that, I may facilitate a short discussion with the panelists before we move on to a Q&A session. So if you have any questions for the panelists, please enter them in the chat box within the Zoom console, and I will choose a selection of questions to read out during our Q&A session. And so without further ado, I'd like to call on Dr. Rizal to kick off our proceedings by discussing what Indonesia's goals for the G20 were this year and how he thinks the country has handled the challenges that 2022 has thrown its way. Dr. Rizal.
Well, good morning. Thank you so much, Sebastian. It's been a privilege really, to be able, to be part of this, the diplomats discussion, because I think, those, who are really following the current affairs and international politics and economics of Indo-Pacific, of course, reading diplomat is basically, you know, a compulsory, I think, things to do.
That's nice of you.
Well, yeah, let me very briefly try to outline, you know, a few points. First, you know, when Indonesia decided, you know, to take up this presidency for 2022, you know, in swap with India, of course, nobody, you know, anticipated that Russia, you know, would, you know, invade Ukraine and then pose a serious challenge. So we were supposed to lead the G20 2023, you know, so it's not 2022. But because, you know, ASEAN chairmanship will be in 2023, so we decided to swap with India. And then at that time, you know, when we started the presidency in December 2021, of course, there are three key main agendas that we want to really achieve. Number one is global health architecture. Number two is digital transformation. And then third, sustainable energy transition. With regard to the global health, you know, for example, you know, we hope that we can agree on issues like, you know, how to strengthen the resilience of countries, you know, in dealing with the pandemic, the financing issues, vaccine, and also affordable medicines, you know, and so on. And in the digital transformation agenda, you know, we hope that we can come up with ideas on how to ensure the equal access, you know, to the digital access, and also how to help the small and medium enterprises, you know, in many emerging economy. On the third theme, energy transition, you know, we will talk about technology transfer and also, of course, the pricing mechanism on carbon trading, you know, and so on. But one cross-cutting message, you know, that Indonesia wants to project really from these three agenda is that it wants to represent the voice of the global South, you know, the emerging economies and also the developing world. You know, you can see from the emphasis that Indonesia want to put on the table for discussion and also for collaboration among the G20 countries. But Russia's invasion, you know, posed a serious problem to that. It really threatened, you know, to derail Indonesia's presidency track. And suddenly we face a new problem, you know, in addition to how to deal with the post-pandemic economic recovery and how to recover together, how to recover stronger, as Indonesia's slogan has it, you know, on the G20. Now, you know, we need also to mitigate the economic impacts of the war, you know, the looming food crisis, the energy crisis, and also more importantly, on the assault on the international principles and international law. So within that context, there are three challenges that I see that Indonesia is still grappling on to find ways to deal with it. Number one, on the questions of attendance, you know, of the leaders from the G20 countries. There are a lot of this discussion, you know, whether Putin will come personally, or, you know, what about the G7 leaders, whether they all will come. But the emerging consensus at the moment is that they all will come. But then the question is really, will they walk out, for example, you know, if Putin also comes, or even if Putin doesn't come and then he wants to deliver his speech through the Zoom, you know, and so on, what would happen and how to manage that, you know, possibility is, I think, a diplomatic challenge for Indonesia. Number two is the format of the meeting itself, you know. Should we have, you know, two rooms, one room, you know, where everybody can talk about the invasion in Ukraine and criticize Russia if they want, and then move to the second room where, you know, I think we can continue with the real agenda of G20 and try to find ways to collaborate to mitigate the economic impacts of the war. The third challenge is really the outcome. Are we going to have real agreement among the G20 members? And then do we plan to have a plan of action on how to follow up those agreements? But my view, I'm a bit skeptical about G20. I think because of the nature of the association, it's not even a real organization. I think that there would be no follow-up because it's really, you know, a mechanism in which, you know, country move from one to the other, you know, to be the presidents of the G20. And then there is, of course, the challenge of continuity all the time. And also the agenda depend on who holds the presidency at, you know, one particular time. So in that context, even though we can have nice communique, you know, and so on, but I don't think that the follow-up, you know, would be easy. Then, you know, of course, because of the three challenges that, especially the challenge number one, you know, the attendance and also the format of the G20 summit in Bali, one might raise the questions why Indonesia has not come forward with a straightforward in opposition to the invasion. Well, Indonesia tried to engage, in a balancing act. It did, condemn the invasion, but not by name, and then we all know that. But we also fought it, yes, at the UNGA and also at the UN Human Rights Commission that allow and also urge the independent investigation of what happened, in Ukraine after the invasion. But this, I think, attitude reflects the domestic public view. And then I think we observe that, there have been a number of studies on this where the Indonesian public, seem to be in favor of Russia, in that context, which is, I think, is quite interesting, to observe, but it's quite embarrassing, if you really want to, go for international law and international principles. It reflects, a degree of anti-Americanism and also a preference for a tough guy, seen to stand up against the West. So that's, I think, the current reality, at the among the public in Indonesia, even though it began to change, especially when, the debate began to enter on issues of principles like sovereignty and the importance of respect for territorial integrity. But the bottom line is that Indonesia really wanted to keep all doors open and to engage all sides, if need be. And that is later on demonstrated by President Jokowi's visit to Kiev and Moscow. And within that context, I think, like you just mentioned in your opening remark, Sebastian, I think Indonesia has the G20, in its mind, because, we know that these geopolitical challenges, brought about by the invasion of Ukraine, cannot be sidelined, and Indonesia cannot just, say that let's put aside the problem in Ukraine and then focus on the key G20 agenda. So because of that, I think the visit really reflects Indonesia's intention and also desire to make sure that everybody would come, to the G20 summit in Bali and then try to address the problem that we face, especially about the impacts of the war. So Indonesia really wants to send a message that major powers have also the moral responsibility, to mitigate the impacts of war. Coming to G20 and talk about it, is one way to show that responsibility. So Jokowi's visit to Moscow and also to Ukraine, I think, really try to give that kind of voice, to give a reminder to all the major powers that it is not Indonesia's problem alone, but also a problem for all members of the G20. If you want to show responsibility, in order to really address the suffering of the global South because of the impact of the war, then, it is important and it is imperative to go to G20 and then talk about it. The final point that I would like to make, whether Jokowi's attempt will succeed, or not, but I think that remains to be seen, of course. So it might not be easy to discern, Jokowi's foreign policy legacy from this diplomatic initiative, but it is certainly possible to outline few reminders about the nature of Indonesia's foreign policy from the way diplomacy is carried out. Domestic factors are still strong, this tendency, to exercise a degree of neutrality and autonomy and also pragmatism. The challenge now is really how to balance both bebas or free and also active element within our foreign policy. We don't want to be bebas, free, but not active. We also don't want to be not active, but bebas or free, So a lot of criticism so far that Indonesia is neither bebas nor active. That I think is the worst option that Indonesia, can undertake, so neither free or nor active. But again, I think this chairmanship of ASEAN also will give new opportunity for Indonesia to once again demonstrate leadership within the regional context. So I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Rizal. That was very enlightening. Dr. Shafiah, I'd like to ask you, to outline, your views on President Jokowi and his approach toward foreign affairs. He's often described as a leader who doesn't have much interest in foreign affairs. And if that is true, then this year's complications due to the Russia-Ukraine war cannot have been very welcome for him. Do you agree with this assessment of Jokowi? And ultimately, how do you think this year's presidency of the G20 and his handling of the associated complications will bear on his legacy?
Okay, a very good morning from Jakarta. So thank you so much, Sebastian, for the invitation to join this morning's seminars. It's really indeed an honor for me to be able to take part in this panel. And also, it's I think, a very important issues that we are discussing right now, and also, I think, very important leading up to the end of Indonesia's G20 presidency, and also sort of like creating expectations of what the legacy of Jokowi's foreign policy will be. Trying to answer your question, I mean, there are a lot of criticisms towards Jokowi and his quote unquote lack of attention to foreign policy issues. I mean, frankly speaking, I think that's oversimplification. And I do think that's, well, it's sort of a lazy assessment, to make when one person's focusing on domestic issues, that automatically means that he's lagging behind on other issues, including foreign policy. I do think that is a lazy assessment to make. I believe that, a lot of domestic projects does not automatically equal to not caring about foreign policy issues. Although, to be fair, also, Jokowi himself has somewhat, openly acknowledged the situation in different interviews. For example, I think I remember in 2019, just after the election but before being sworn in for his second term, I think in a response to a question from the Jakarta Post, whether or not he planned to play a greater role in directly leading the country's diplomatic efforts in the second term, I think he answered in the line that he believes that there are much more pressing domestic issues to be dealt with, although he also acknowledges that domestic affairs requires more attention, but he would continue to be engaged in several major international forums. I think I think there's a midway between all this. For Indonesia, domestic audience and domestic interests still come before global audience and global common interest. I think that's the easiest way to describe this. I think this is fair, considering the common definition of foreign policy says it involves actions or activities conducted by a government to defend and promote its national interests. So what Jokowi is doing is I think is fair, and that's that is the definition of foreign policy. But I think what can be problematic, and I think this is the case for Indonesia, is that when a certain role is assigned based on the expectation of what the country should ideally achieve, and this is the case for a country like Indonesia, thus the quote unquote sometimes disappointment regarding Indonesia's foreign policy. So I think, for Indonesia, there is indeed an aspiration to be a global player. This has always been the case. I grew up during the Suharto era where, we were taught at the formal education since the very young age that Indonesia has a strategic position at the crossroad between two oceans and two continents and so on. And this was embedded in the minds of the young people that the constitution mandates Indonesia to contribute to world order and so on. But on the other hand, there are clear limitations, and acting on a range of foreign policy issues require resources which are not fully available to domestic development challenges. And I think this is more apparent when, the importance of foreign policy for the domestic audience is still important. And this is more apparent when certain issues are blown up by the media, for example, the South China Sea, relations with major power, and of course now the war in Ukraine. But I guess the bottom line that I'm trying to emphasize is national interest and pleasing the domestic audience still plays a huge chunk in Indonesia's foreign policy, in the middle of calls and aspiration to be a global player that contribute to global interest. And I think Dr. Rizal's earlier point about Jokowi's visit to Ukraine and Russia is also a good example for this. I mean, an ideal situation would be for Indonesia to take part in a major peacemaking role. But as Dr. Rizal mentioned, a lot of this was done with G20 in mind and Indonesia's intention to make sure the G20 summit in Bali is a success, which I think is something that Jokowi himself would like to make sure that it is actually a success. I guess a failed summit in Bali later on in the year would be a total national embarrassment in some way. And a lot of other issues that are domestically oriented is also shaping Jokowi's visit to Ukraine on food and energy crisis, which are the impacts of the war, which is directly felt in Indonesia, is also shaping some of these issues. So last point regarding your last question, how will this year's presidency of the G20 and also the complications with regards to the Russia-Ukraine war bear on Jokowi's legacy? I mean, it's interesting. Approaching the presidency, the government carried out a lot of activities to promote it domestically. So not only answering to aspirations to make sure that the G20 would promote a global common interest, but domestically, the government carried out a lot of activities to promote it, in particular raising the awareness of the benefits of the G20 and hosting the summit for Indonesia's economy. So for example, in a speech in November 2021, the president pressed the country to make the most of its strategic position in the G20 to, quote unquote, I quote here, prioritize national interest. So I think this is also interesting, reading what Indonesia wants to achieve in the G20, not only by G20's objectives in global common goods, but also of Indonesia's national interest. Translating how the G20 presidency would benefit the country, I guess, especially in the early months of the period, has been a main part of the government's effort to ensure support and also success. As for playing a global role or raising to a global prominence through the G20, I think it is useful to look at that Indonesia is still not the same prominence as the developed member of the G20. Realistically, Indonesia's approach, as I said, has also been limited to translating to its domestic interests rather than aiming high to play a global role to promote global common good in this regard. So I think I'll end my short remarks here by saying that for Jokowi at the time being, the success of the G20 presidency itself and this, as will be highlighted by the summit later on this year, is of great importance. And I think he personally believes that it will add to his legacy in foreign policy as well. Back to you, Sebastian.
Thank you. So this, this sort of leads us to the question of, in the broader trajectory of Indonesian foreign policy and its foreign policy tradition since independence. Professor Gede, you argued in a recent article that the Russia-Ukraine war was a sign that Indonesia needed to rethink the brand of non-alignment that it has adhered to, or at least claimed to adhere to, since its independence. Can you lay out your argument for us, and how does this argument apply to the growing strategic competition between China and the United States, and Indonesia's position within that?
Yes, thank you very much, Bastian. Very warm greetings from us in Surabaya. Let me address your question by talking about a broader conceptual perspective which underlies my argument about the need to rethink of Indonesia's non-aligned foreign policy. I will divide my argument into three sections. The first, I will talk about the recent world order, just a brief outlook. And then secondly, I will talk about what happened in Indonesia. And the third, we can see what should Indonesia do for the future. The first, my argument starts from distinguishing the world order today and in the Cold War. during the Cold War, we see that great power politics dominated. Ideology is the most important agenda. Then when the Cold War was over, there is an optimism about the future of multilateralism. States, non-state actors would cooperate to resolve the global issues and achieve what many say common goods, or if we talk about English school perspective, they will say the goals of international society. But the problem is what happened over the last 5 or 10 years is the comeback of geopolitics. COVID-19, Russian war in Ukraine demonstrated to us that geopolitics is intensifying, and now geopolitics is leading while multilateralism is going backward. I do not say that multilateralism is not useful or is useless, but the notion of geopolitics, what I say, a realist worldview is getting stronger, is getting clearer as the most priority or the most important direction of many countries' foreign policy. Let's see G20. If we analyze G20, we can obviously see a contradictory power games between the major powers, the US, Japan, China, Russia, and the middle powers. This is a good reflection of how geopolitics and multilateralism conflict. In a group we understand as the leading organization of world politics today beside the UN, but they have similar weaknesses. They just coordinate, cooperate, but they cannot manifest the goals or control or lead the world agenda. And this is the problem of G20. So if Dr. Rizal is skeptical about what Indonesia can do in G20, I can understand. This is my first point of view. Secondly, I'm a student of Dr. Rizal Sukma, and I read his writing in 1995 about the history of Indonesian foreign policy, and I strongly agree with him, saying that pragmatism, independence are the most important values in Indonesian foreign policy because of the history of revolution, diplomacy, and others. So we should understand independent and active. If people say it is a pragmatic foreign policy, yes, indeed, it is pragmatic, but it has a good reason to do that. My point for the Jokowi government is in 2014, there was an optimism. When Indonesia launched its global maritime fulcrum or axis or whatever, that this country would have a clear and strong foreign policy direction by acknowledging its maritime geography, its sea power, economic development is a focus on the maritime areas, and it was so promising for us in Indonesia. However, what happened in 2019? This discourse, this policy disappeared. Dr. Vivi wrote something somewhere in 2017 explaining that the Indonesian ocean policy lacks of international dimensions. Yes, I agree with that. Because the global maritime fulcrum was oriented to serve the purpose of domestic political economic development. But the problem today is Indonesia runs in world politics without a grand strategy, without a strategy. I do not say a grand strategy, it is a different concept. Without a clear strategy if we read planning of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2019, it just copied the 2015 without the words of maritime fulcrum. And the question is, what Indonesia is going to achieve in world politics? If we analyze what happened to this, I arrive at a conclusion that our foreign policy is driven by a combination of courteous populism and pragmatic nationalism. Jokowi is a populist leader. I agree with many scholars introducing this concept and explanation, and it happens. Although he's populist in domestic politics, but he's very courteous in foreign policy, and both are linked to each other, and it impact on Indonesian position. While Indonesia want to move toward China, it has to care about domestic voices. When Indonesia wants to strengthen relations with the US, the government has to face with anti-Americanism and others. So the public view, the populist interest hinder how Indonesian foreign policy should be formulated as a global actor. And my third argument, seeing from these two perspectives, from the weakening multilateralism and from the confusion of Indonesian foreign policy, what Indonesia needs to do in the future is to reconsider whether we still want to be non-bloc or we want to find out something else. I read Indonesian foreign policy and the Indo-Pacific. I read something also about this in a journal. And the Asian outlook on the Indo-Pacific has not been manifested into a real form of regional order up to now. So what Indonesia has today, it has no more global maritime fulcrum, it has no more Indo-Pacific outlook, and it operates in world politics without a clear identity. The only thing Indonesia still maintains is its non-blocs, and non-bloc is placed in the wrong direction. It is regarded as an end of foreign policy, not a means. The real understanding about non-bloc is it is a means of foreign policy. We can achieve objective through taking non-bloc. Not we want to achieve an objective of becoming non-bloc by sacrificing interest. If Indonesia is really wanting to cooperate with Russia, why should we care about the West? If Indonesia needs military assistance from the West, and why should we think too much about China? So in this context, let me say we need a more dynamic non-bloc, as what India exemplifies through its multi-alignment. I'm researching on this concept, and after now, but for now, I cannot tell too much about how multi-alignment will work in Indonesia. But my view is let's change the direction of foreign policy from non-bloc to something more dynamic. Thanks, Sebastian.
Thank you, Gede. I was wondering before we move on to the Q&A and other discussions, whether the other two panelists have any responses to what you said about non-alignment as a means rather than an end. You know, Dr. Shafiah, Dr. Rizal, do either of you have any any response to that? Do you agree, disagree, or? Oh, I think you're on mute still.
Yes, sorry. No, I think non-alignment as a movement is dead. It's basically, I don't see why, we need to stick, to that. But non-alignment merely reflects, a kind of attitudes, kind of orientation or outlook, if you like. But of course, it cannot be, wanton neutrality. So, I think we need to have respect for certain widely and globally recognized principles, before we really deploy or employ the non-aligned orientation. So that's, I think what non-aligned means. So in terms of movement, it's no more there, but it's still an outlook. But what I think is more important is basically to develop, well, this is cliche, but still useful, strategic autonomy, in foreign policy, which really reflects the norms of bebas and active, free and independent, because if you use that, principle, well, I do believe that other countries also, has the same, I think principles, they all want to be free, they all want to be, I think, active, but nevertheless, national interest is really, I think, at the core of any foreign policy. And secondly, I would like to go back, to what Ibu Fifi mentioned. I think Pak Jokowi really brings back the function of foreign policy, into its conventional meaning in its purest form, to basically serve an instrument to achieve, a national interest defined in terms of, economic agenda. So, but of course, I think that's, what really make it difficult for any observers, to answer your question about what is the legacy of, this government's foreign policy, because foreign policy has returned to its traditional function to serve national interest. And then under Pak Jokowi, national interest is more or less, is the economic, interest. I think that's, it's very important, to keep in mind, because it's not monolithic as well. So we do observe what I call the foreign ministry driven, foreign policy. For example, this, attention to the UN, the NPTs, the disarmament, all these traditional agenda. That's basically the foreign ministry's, a foreign policy. And then there is also this economic or investment-driven foreign policy, probably led by the coordinating Ministry of Maritime and Investment and also coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs. So that's why we see, I think, the closer move to China, to the Emirate Arabs in our foreign policy and so on, because the economic agenda drives, this foreign policy or the conduct of foreign policy. Then, of course, we also have what I call Jokowi-driven foreign policy agenda, which mainly on the investment, on how international cooperation can actually contribute to his, domestic agenda, especially economic development, but also on some issues critical for Indonesia and the region, such as ASEAN and Myanmar. I think that's, I think what are the forces in Indonesia at the moment that shape, foreign policy. And of course, because the actors have become more complex, we see, as if one group, will be pulling Indonesia to one direction, and the other group will try to pull the country to another direction as well. So that complexity, I think, make it difficult for Ibu Fifi, to answer your question. What is the legacy of, President Jokowi's in foreign policy? Thank you.
Dr. Shafiah, do you have anything to add to that?
Just a little bit, yeah, on the non-aligned movement. Yeah, I think I'm also to second Pak Rizal's comments about non-alignment as a movement. I mean, it's really hard to plan a future for a country based on a movement that's non-aligned. But the spirit of a country not wanting to be aligned with certain countries, I think is still very much out there. And I think Indonesia's sort of like neutrality position also applies to this. But what's more important, I think, not really this claim of being non-aligned, but more on the ability of a country to sort of like determine or measure or judge which issues they should be involved in, and through which channel they should promote their national interests in the midst of these issues. And this is something that, well, not only Indonesia, but I think a lot of countries are also having difficulties in being able to pick and choose which line of diplomacy would be good to be involved in which global issues. And I think this is something that to be able to strategize its position in the global affairs, I think is something that Indonesia is still having a challenge of, but I think it's not alone. A lot of countries are facing the same challenge as well. Thank you.
Thanks. So we've got a couple of questions here in the Q&A. We've got one from William Tucrello, who asks, how much influence does Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi have in shaping foreign policy under Jokowi? Dr. Rizal, you mentioned before that, that a certain degree of Indonesia's foreign policy is foreign ministry driven, but I wonder if you or any of the other panelists have any more thoughts about that. Foreign Minister Retno seems to have been quite active on issues such as Myanmar, for example, which Jokowi has not really, to my knowledge, commented on.
Well, of course, the overall framework of the foreign policy and the foreign policy agenda, I think Ibu Retno plays a very instrumental role, in giving inputs and also conduct of foreign policy, under Pak Jokowi. But, I think this is more on the conventional foreign policy agendas, like, we know. But when it comes to the other aspect of the conduct of foreign relations, such as the economic and also investment and trade and so on, then other ministry, ought to play also, important roles. Ministry of Trade and also the coordinating Ministry of Investment and Maritime Affairs and the economic affairs. But, when it comes to foreign policy in the traditional sense, in conventional sense, and Ibu Retno is the chief diplomat that really shaped the formulation and also the conduct of foreign policy. But as Indonesia is becoming more and more democratic and also, I think, heavily driven by economic agenda, then of course other actors, including those outside the foreign ministry and the government institution, I think constantly also give inputs into the shaping of foreign policy. Thank you.
Do either the other panelists have any comments on that?
Yes. Let me address your question by looking at the three types of foreign policy. The first is programmatic, second is routine, and third is crisis foreign policy. What Foreign Ministry Retno is doing is on the last categories of foreign policy in making reform in the foreign ministry institution, in the bureaucracy, and in responding to crisis. But the weakness is into putting Indonesian foreign policy as a visionary, in a visionary outlook of the country. It is very difficult for me as an academic to find out the answer of what is Indonesia going to be in the future. A global maritime fulcrum, an actor in Indo-Pacific, a global digital economic player, a bridge of Western and Eastern cultures, or else, I don't know. And it is something that we need for a big country like Indonesia. Big country, I mean, it's not a great power, yeah? And Indonesia needs that, at least for the 2024 election, when new leader will come and new foreign policy ideas must be installed as a direction for Indonesia's future. And then this point is absent in Minister Marsudi's foreign policy action.
Thanks. Now I wanted to, Professor Rizal mentioned before, the question of ASEAN, Indonesia's role within ASEAN, and the Myanmar crisis, which is obviously has been described as a huge test for ASEAN and its cohesion, its effectiveness. I wondered if the panelists could speak a little bit about how Indonesia has approached that country's crisis. Foreign Minister Retno has been relatively active in trying to nudge the military junta toward the implementation of ASEAN's 5-point consensus. Indonesia hosted the special summit that took place in April last year, at which that consensus was reached. Indonesia is, of course, the largest nation in ASEAN and hosts the Secretariat. How do the panelists view the current administration's approach toward ASEAN, and perhaps using the Myanmar crisis as a lens to examine that question?
Okay, if I can respond to that, Sebastian.
Sure.
There are two bodies of growing views on this. One, basically, just drop the 5-point consensus. It's not working, right? But the second view says that, look, this is the only thing that we got, so we need to continue to find ways how to implement it. The third view, which I'm advocating at the moment, is like, probably there is something in between. So we have, I think, made mistakes so far by thinking that the three key elements, the cessation of hostilities, and then the humanitarian assistance and the dialogue, all to be conducted, in sequence, one by one. So I think it has to start with the cessation of hostilities or violence, and then so on. But in my view, we should now, under Indonesia's chairmanship, we should just go to the third part. Try to encourage the all-inclusive dialogues, among the key holders, stakeholders in Myanmar. But of course, the key question is really, can we trust, the junta in Myanmar, or will they be willing to actually, negotiate and sit with others? The second, I think Indonesia need to really bring everyone in ASEAN to discuss key questions, which we have not discussed so far. This has been raised by Malaysia's foreign minister on the end game. But I think I would rephrase it into, like, what is the end objective? Two views, right? One would say that we need to restore order and stability in Myanmar. What does it mean? Can we accept order and stability, or can we accept junta if they can really ensure order and stability? The second view said, no, it has to be the return of democracy. That means, then the military should withdraw, and then, the civilian who won the election in November should come back and then rule, the country legitimately, because they're the one who, won the election. And ASEAN has not touched this issue. What sort of objective that we want, through this 5-point consensus, But I would say that Indonesia should insist that, the return of democratic government is the key objective that we need, to push. Then really, of course, whether we can do that with the 5-point consensus, that is, the question that we all still grappling with. Indonesia is going to take up the chairmanship in ASEAN, and this is the challenge that we face. Number two, I think we learned from the Myanmar crisis, there are a lot of problems with the ASEAN Charter, and also with the mechanism of the decision-making process, with the absence of the how ASEAN should deal with the crisis, and so on. So I think through the high-level task force panel that has been set up since last year, so I think Indonesia should really try to encourage other ASEAN countries to address those weaknesses in the ASEAN Charter, especially with regard to the decision-making process, the regime sanctions that we need to have, the financing aspect, and also the crisis management. So we do have opportunity through that mechanism that has been agreed by all the leaders, that the high-level panel should come up with the answers to those kind of problems that we face.
Dr. Shafiah, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. I'm not going to comment on specifically on Myanmar. I think Dr. Rizal has explained that better than anyone else. But I'd like to probably touch upon your second part of your question, which is Indonesia's general approach to ASEAN. And I do think that the official foreign policy line of Indonesia still views ASEAN and all the ASEAN-led frameworks as the center of regional security cooperation and the main vehicle to basically maintain security and stability in the region. But absolutely, the limitations of ASEAN are now more apparent than ever. I mean, Dr. Rizal explained about the weaknesses of ASEAN simply based on the ASEAN Charter. And I think, not sure to make things worse or to make things better, but there are such high expectations for Indonesia's chairmanship next year, which is, I think, is bound to a lot of disappointments to a lot of people having such high expectation about what Indonesia can do, because as I said, the limitations are very clear about ASEAN itself and the structure and the workings of ASEAN, and what Indonesia can actually do to try to change anything, to try to fix all these weaknesses within ASEAN. Next year is going to be a tough year. Not only because of the challenges already existing within ASEAN and Southeast Asia, including Myanmar, but I think also the challenge due to this really high expectations from a lot of countries about what Indonesia can do as chair next year.
Okay, so we've got probably enough time for one more question. We got a question from James Corcoran asking, you know, the panelists, how optimistic are you that the goals of Indonesia's G20 chairmanship, you know, these include promoting national economic resilience, culture, tourism, and creative industries, promoting Indonesian leadership and commitment on global issues. You know, how optimistic are you three that these will be these goals, which one could already describe as optimistic goals even prior to the Russia-Ukraine situation? You know, how optimistic are you that these will be achieved in the current regional and global circumstances?
Well, I think, you know, those objectives cannot be achieved only through one, you know, particular vehicles or platform, which is the G20, because, you know, this is an ongoing side effect, if you like, of any Indonesia's, you know, diplomatic, you know, initiative. So there would be, you know, ASEAN related summits next year. So this has been, you know, I think the diplomatic goals all along. Even though, you know, I think we can add another one there, you know, the sovereignty diplomacy, because this is one of the 4 objectives that, you know, foreign ministry has set out as the agenda of Indonesia's national interest in terms of foreign policy conduct, you know, which is how to make sure that, you know, all the countries in the world, you know, respect and respect Indonesia's national territorial integrity and sovereignty. So I don't think that it can be achieved, you know, in only with the G20, but it will continue, you know, even, you know, well into the new government after 2024. So these are the basic, you know, consistent and also continuously fulfill agenda and national interest.
Gede, do you have anything to add to that?
The recover stronger rhetoric of G20, in my view, is an awareness of these world leaders about the serious consequences of conducting diplomacy without trust. What we learned from COVID-19, from Myanmar crisis, from Russian invasion in the Ukraine is the loss of trust in diplomacy. And what Indonesia should do or can do is to promote the sense of trust. Although I agree with Dr. Sukma that the goals will not be achieved alone or only by the G20, but at least Indonesia can demonstrate the meaning and the significance of revitalizing trust in diplomacy. ASEAN most obvious weaknesses is the organization performs trust, but it has no trust in between the association. So for the future foreign policy agenda of Indonesia is to build regional trust, to promote trust in global multilateral institution, and it will make diplomacy work, and it can mitigate the impacts of the return of geopolitics. Thanks, Sebastian.
Thank you. Shafiah, do you have any final thoughts before we wind up proceedings?
Just very quickly, I think it's interesting, asking, will these objectives be achieved? I think it's even difficult to measure or create indicators at which point are these objectives achieved, right? If the objective is to promote something, promote tourism, promote national interest, it's actually very difficult to have any indicator at which point these objectives are achieved.
Right.
But I think if you want to, sort of like have a clear a simple indicator of the intention given to Indonesia and at which point some of the interests are promoted, then I do believe that at least part of this objectives can be somewhat achieved, not exclusively through G20, but I guess overall activities that Indonesia has throughout the year.
Wonderful. Well, I think we will wind up proceedings there. On behalf of the diplomat, I would like to once again extend our gratitude to our three panelists for all of their insights. If you're interested in reliving the magic, you'll be able to find this video shortly on our YouTube site. We'll also be beaming it out on our social media networks. Or if there's anybody that couldn't attend, you'd like to pass the video along, feel free to do that. Otherwise, keep your eyes pasted to our website, thediplomat.com. We cover Asia, every aspect of politics, current affairs, society in Asia. And, there's always something there for people who are interested in the region. But yes, with that, I would like to wind things up and extend again some gratitude to our three panelists for participating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sebastian.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.